The morning Lila Montgomery left the only home she had known for 3 long years, frost clung to the window panes like tiny accusing fingers. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Greaves, stood in the doorway of the Blackthorn Valley homestead, arms crossed, mouth pressed into a line that had judged Lila since the day she married into the family. "Pack your things," Mrs. Greaves said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "We need this room for a woman who can give us grandchildren." Her husband, Elias, slouched behind his mother, eyes fixed on the floorboards he had never once defended her on. His brothers lingered near the kitchen, shuffling their feet, refusing to meet her gaze. Lila's belongings, a flour sack containing 3 dresses, 2 aprons, a worn Bible, and a hairbrush, were tossed onto the porch. They thudded against the wood, echoing like accusations in her chest. Then came the coins. 3 silver dollars. They rolled toward her feet, catching the pale morning light. "For your trouble," Mrs. Greaves said. Lila stared at them. 3 years of scrubbing floors. 3 years of tending fires. 3 years of kneeling beside sickbeds. 3 years of praying for a child who never came. 3 silver dollars. She bent slowly, picked up each coin with deliberate grace, and slipped them into her pocket. Then she lifted her chin and met her mother-in-law's steely gaze. "I see," Lila said quietly. She hoisted the flour sack onto her shoulder, turned her back to the homestead, and walked down the dirt road stretching toward the horizon. Her steps were steady, her spine straight. They would not see her break. When the hills swallowed the homestead behind her, Lila stopped, set down the sack, pressed both palms against her stomach, the same stomach they had called cursed. "My child," she whispered to the emptiness, "if you like, take your time. But one day, when you finally choose me, they will kneel and beg to count your fingers. They will regret losing you." The wind carried her vow across the Blackthorn Valley grasslands. She picked up her sack and kept walking. By the time Lila reached the settlement of Red Willow, her boots were blistered, her throat parched, her stomach gnawing with hunger. The town was small, a single main street, a general store with peeling paint, a blacksmith pumping smoke into the afternoon air, a crooked steepled church, a saloon with piano music drifting through open doors, and ranches spreading across the land like promises. The general store bell rang as she pushed open the door. The air smelled of coffee, leather, and soap. Shelves lined with canned goods, bolts of fabric, farming tools, and jars of medicine framed the walls. A man stood behind the counter, middle-aged, balding, spectacles perched on his nose. A sign read, "Red Willow General Store." "I'm looking for work," Lila said, her voice steady despite trembling legs. The storekeeper glanced at her, noting the dusty dress, the flour sack, the weariness she could not quite hide. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Anything," Lila said. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. I can keep accounts if needed." He scratched his chin. "Sorry, miss. Nothing right now. Try Mrs. Marlowe at the boarding house down the road. She sometimes needs help with laundry." Her chest tightened, but she nodded. She turned toward the door, only to stumble over a heavy sack of grain left in the aisle. Arms flailing, she grabbed instinctively for the nearest solid thing, the arm of a man examining a coil of rope nearby. His hands, large and calloused, steadied her. He smelled of horses, leather, and sun-warmed grass. She looked up. A tall, broad-shouldered man, dark hair falling across his forehead, storm-gray eyes, a scar cutting through his left brow. A man carved from the frontier itself. "Lord above," she muttered, clutching his shirt. "First day in town, and I'm already falling about like a fool." He steadied her, then released her waist. "You all right?" His voice was low, rough-edged. "I'm fine," she said quickly, smoothing her skirt. The storekeeper cleared his throat. "Harrison still looking for help at your ranch?" The man, Harrison, Lila noted, glanced at him, then at her. His gaze lingered on her dusty hands, her sack, her trembling legs. "I need someone for cooking and cleaning," he said finally. Housework, fair pay, $20 a month, room and board included. She studied him. What's the catch? No catch, he said. The ranch is 10 miles out. Separate room, honest work. Nothing beyond that. Something in his eyes, lonely, careful, made her believe him. Or maybe she was just desperate enough to take the risk. I'll take it, Lila said, lifting her flour sack. When do I start? Now, if you're ready, he nodded. They rode out of Red Willow in silence. Lila sat beside Harrison, watching the prairie stretch endlessly around them, golden grass rippling under the wind, distant mountains rising like blue ghosts on the horizon. The sky arched so wide, it made her chest ache with something dangerously close to hope. The ranch appeared after an hour. A sturdy cabin with stone chimney, a barn with weathered red paint, corrals for cattle and horses, a windmill turning lazily in the breeze. Harrison helped her down from the wagon, brief hands on her waist steadying her, and led her inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. "This is yours," he said, setting her sack on the narrow bed in a small, clean room with a simple quilt and a cross on the wall. Lila pressed her hand to her stomach, whispering again, softly, almost reverently, "Let's see what we can make of this place." The wind howled outside, the prairie stretching endlessly. Inside, she felt something unfamiliar, a fragile, cautious spark of possibility. Lila woke before dawn the next morning. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft whistle of wind through the cracks in the logs. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and moved to the kitchen, her fingers stiff from the cold. The floorboards creaked under her boots, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint warmth left from last night's fire. Harrison was already in the barn, the soft clop of hooves announcing his presence. She could see him through the window, tending Copper, the chestnut stallion, brushing the dust from his coat with careful, deliberate strokes. His shoulders moved with the rhythm of hard work, steady, unhurried. He did not glance her way, but she could feel his presence like a silent anchor, steadying the morning around her. Breakfast was simple: cornmeal porridge with a splash of milk, black coffee in a tin cup, but Lila took her time, savoring each bite. The wind rattled the cabin door, and she paused mid-sip, listening. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the cabin walls, its openness both comforting and intimidating. She felt small and yet fiercely alive, a seed planted in unbroken soil. By mid-morning, Lila was sweeping the cabin floor, humming softly to herself. Dust danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. The rhythm of the broom was hypnotic, a steady beat against the worn boards. A sudden clatter at the door made her jump. She turned to see Harrison, muddy boots and all, holding a feed bucket for the chickens. "Watch where you sweep," he said, though there was no bite in his voice. "Those Rhode Island Reds can be temperamental." "They always are," she muttered, scattering corn with exaggerated care. "I think they enjoy testing my patience." Harrison leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. The corners of his mouth twitched, a small flicker of amusement. "I'll fix that nail after lunch," he said eventually, nodding toward the floor. "It keeps snagging the broom." Lila raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She worked harder, the scrape of bristles against wood echoing through the cabin. There was comfort in routine, in the steady rhythm of chores. It filled the silence, giving shape to her days, tethering her to something she could control. Over the next few weeks, the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. Lila cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, and mended Harrison's shirts. He repaired fences, worked the cattle, and broke horses with practiced hands. Their conversations were brief at first, punctuated by nods and occasional directions, but the silence between them slowly became less empty, more charged. She noticed small things: how he paused in the doorway to watch her knead bread, how his gaze lingered on her hands as she worked, how he always returned to the cabin at dusk, weary but present. She caught him once, standing by the barn, arms crossed, listening while she sang softly to herself as she hung laundry. "You know," she said one afternoon, carrying a basket of vegetables onto the porch, "for a man who barely talks, you're surprisingly observant." Harrison looked up from mending a harness, eyes steady. For a woman who talks constantly, you're surprisingly tolerable." She laughed, a sound that seemed to startle even her. It carried across the prairie, light and unrestrained. He didn't respond with words, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch ever so slightly, almost a smile. The first storm came in late October. Lila woke to thunder rattling the windows, rain hammering the roof like thousands of tiny fists. She dressed quickly, hands shaking from both cold and anticipation. Harrison was already outside, securing horses in the barn, his movements calm, precise, though the wind tore at his coat like invisible hands. "I'll come with you," she said, grabbing her shawl. "You don't have to." "I'm coming," she insisted. They ran through the mud, wind biting at their faces. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the barn in sharp, blinding flashes. Inside, the horses stamped and whinnied, eyes wide with fear. Harrison lit a lantern, the small flame casting long shadows across the barn walls. "Talk to them," he instructed quietly. "Keep them calm." Lila placed a trembling hand on Daisy's neck, feeling the horse tremble under her touch. "Easy, girl," she murmured. "Nothing's going to hurt you." "I promise." Thunder boomed, shaking the rafters, and Daisy reared. Harrison's arm shot out, steadying Lila against his chest. Rain ran down their clothes, soaking them both. The heat between them was sudden, immediate, almost unbearable. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling, hearts hammering. "If I do something foolish now," she whispered, barely audible, "we'll both blame the storm," he replied, voice low, rough. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them. Then the stall door banged sharply, breaking the moment, and they stepped apart, chests heaving, pretending nothing had shifted between them. After the storm passed, the cabin smelled of wet wood and horse sweat. Harrison hung the lanterns high, casting a warm glow across the room. Lila cleaned the barn quietly, her heart still racing from the storm and from the closeness she had felt. The days grew colder as November came, frost painting the windows in delicate crystalline patterns. Life at the ranch continued, steady and demanding. Lila and Harrison fell into a rhythm, each finding comfort in the other's presence without needing words. She sang while she worked. He slowed his steps when passing her, pausing ever so slightly in the doorway, his gaze tracing her movements with quiet attentiveness. Evenings brought warmth, the firelight flickering across their faces as they worked or rested. The unspoken tension simmered, tender and fragile. They did not name it, did not act on it yet, but it wrapped around them like the cold prairie wind outside. By mid-November, the ranch felt like home to Lila. She knew the floorboards, the creaks, the smells of wood smoke and leather. She knew the horses, names, their habits, their quirks. And she knew Harrison watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. One morning, while scrubbing the kitchen floor, she noticed muddy footprints from Harrison's boots crossing the freshly cleaned boards. Her jaw dropped. "Really?" she said. Harrison froze mid-step, eyes flicking down at the tracks. "I didn't realize you just—" "Of course you didn't," Lila interrupted, gesturing with exaggerated exasperation. "Men never notice when something's clean." He bent down slowly, unlacing his boots, placing them neatly by the door. Then he poured himself coffee, sat at the table, and simply watched her work. She muttered under her breath, bristles scratching against wood, and he only said, "You're good at muttering, I can tell." Quote, for the first time since leaving Blackthorn Valley, Lila felt something fragile stir in her chest, something like trust, something like hope. Winter tightened its grip on Red Willow. Frost painted the cabin windows with delicate lace patterns, and snow lay thick over the prairie, muffling the usual sounds of cattle and wind. Lila woke early, rubbing her hands together, cheeks pink from the cold, and began her chores. She fed the chickens, scattering corn with careful precision. "Show some manners," she muttered to them, wagging a finger at a particularly aggressive Rhode Island red. The bird pecked her ankle. "You're going in the stew pot if you do that again," she warned, shaking her head and shoving it away. Harrison entered the cabin, boots leaving muddy prints on the clean floor. "Having trouble?" he asked, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes alert. Only with inanimate objects, Lila said, tugging at a stubborn broom. They refused to cooperate. Harrison's expression softened just a little. I'll fix that nail today. Thank you. Quote. Lila smiled faintly, though her muscles ached from the scrub and sweep. There was comfort in the rhythm of her work, in the quiet routine that stretched across long winter days. And Harrison, silent, steady, was always nearby. Watching, protecting. They settled into a quiet companionship. Lila cooked hearty meals, thick stews, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. Harrison tended cattle, repaired fences, and maintained the barn. When he returned each evening, she would catch him pausing in the doorway, watching her move about the kitchen, his hat in hand, his eyes lingering just long enough to make her pulse quicken. One afternoon, she brought him coffee while he mended a harness on the porch. You know, she said, blowing on the steaming cup, for a man who barely talks, you're surprisingly good company. Harrison looked up, hands still on the leather. For a woman who talks constantly, you're surprisingly tolerable. Lila laughed, the sound bubbling up from her chest, light and free, carrying across the snow-covered yard. He didn't respond with words, but the corner of his mouth twitched ever so slightly, almost a smile. As the days passed, subtle intimacy grew between them. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on her fingers when she needed bread, the way he slowed when passing by the kitchen window, the small attentiveness that spoke louder than any words. One evening, a snowstorm rattled the cabin. Lila lit the fire, the warm glow spilling across the wooden walls. Harrison joined her on the porch, wrapping his coat tighter against the wind. The prairie lay blanketed in white, silent except for the distant howl of a coyote. Do you ever get lonely out here? Lila asked softly, her breath forming small clouds. Sometimes, he admitted after a pause, but you stay anyway. Easier than being lonely in a crowd. She nodded, understanding more than he could now. She had lived surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Loneliness in a crowd was heavier than solitude. Exactly, she whispered. Loneliness is worse when you're supposed to belong somewhere, but don't. Quote. Harrison's gray eyes studied her, searching her face. Is that how it was for you? I tried, she admitted. I really tried. Prayed, worked, did everything, but it was never enough. That wasn't your fault, he said firmly. His certainty surprised her. She looked at him fully, seeing the quiet strength that anchored her. I've seen how hard you work, he continued, how much you care, how you sing while you cook, talk to the chickens like they're your children, mend things no one asks you to mend. If they couldn't see that, the fault was theirs, not yours. Lila's throat tightened. No one had ever defended her so completely. She blinked rapidly, tears threatening, and whispered, "Thank you." Harrison didn't speak, but his gaze softened, warm and steady, and for the first time in years, Lila felt entirely seen. The storm passed. The days grew shorter. Their rhythm remained, steady, comfortable, tender. Lila cooked, Harrison worked the land, and in quiet moments, their hands would brush, their eyes would meet, charged with something neither yet named. One night, Lila scrubbed the kitchen floor while Harrison entered from the barn, tracking mud across the boards. Really, she said, incredulous. I didn't realize, he began, but she cut him off. Of course you didn't. Men never notice clean floors. He bent, unlaced his boots, set them neatly aside, then poured himself coffee. Lila resumed her work, muttering about mud and oblivious ranchers. Harrison only watched, eyes soft, and said, "You're good at muttering. I've had years of practice." I can tell. Their days blurred together, filled with honest work, small laughter, and subtle tenderness. And through it all, Lila felt the first real stirrings of hope, the fragile sense that perhaps, in this wide, harsh prairie, she might finally belong. The fire in the cabin crackled low that evening as she scrubbed, the stars wheeling overhead outside. Somewhere beyond the walls, Harrison moved silently, steady, and present. She didn't yet know how close they were to each other, or how inevitable it would feel when they finally let themselves see it. But the air between them had shifted, charged with possibility. Spring arrived slowly over Red Willow. The snow had melted, leaving the prairie green and dotted with wildflowers. Indian paintbrush, lupine, and soft pink prairie roses swaying in the breeze. Lila's days were full, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, mending clothes, and watching the horses with quiet care. Harrison worked steadily alongside her, repairing fences, breaking horses, and overseeing the cattle. Their interactions had grown warmer, softer, charged with a subtle, unspoken tension. Lila noticed how Harrison paused just a fraction longer in doorways, how his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. She found herself humming while she worked, a quiet song that carried across the barn and caught him sometimes standing just beyond the shadows, listening, still, patient. One afternoon, she brought him coffee as he repaired a harness on the porch. "For a man who rarely speaks, you're quite good company," she said lightly, blowing on the steaming tin cup. Harrison's hands stilled on the leather. "For a woman who talks constantly, you're surprisingly tolerable," he replied, his voice low, edged with something that made her chest flutter. Lila laughed. A full, unguarded sound that made the cold afternoon seem warmer. He didn't smile openly, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. As the weeks passed, the tension between them grew, subtle but impossible to ignore. Their hands brushed over dishes at supper, lingered when passing clothes, met and held in moments that seemed accidental but were carefully remembered. Each shared glance, each gentle word, added a layer of warmth and trust. Then came the late spring storm, sudden and fierce. Thunder rolled across the prairie, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white lines. Lila wrapped herself in a shawl and followed Harrison to the barn. Rain hammered down, soaking them both, wind tearing at their coats. Horses panicked, stamping and whinnying, eyes wide with fear. Harrison lit a lantern, its flickering glow casting long shadows on the walls. "Easy now," Lila whispered to Daisy, the mare shivering beneath her touch. Harrison's arm shot out, steadying her against his chest. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling. Electricity, or something deeper, rippled between them. "If I do something foolish now," she whispered, voice barely audible over the storm, "we'll both blame the weather," he said, low and rough. For a moment, the world narrowed to just them. The storm, the rain, the wind, it all fell away. Then the barn door banged, and the spell broke. They stepped apart, chests heaving, hearts racing, pretending the heat between them hadn't changed everything. Winter gave way to early summer. Their domestic routine became infused with quiet intimacy. She sang while she worked. He lingered silently in the doorway, watching, his presence steady and comforting. Playful arguments grew into a dance of words and gestures. She scolded him for leaving coffee grounds in the sink. He teased her for talking to the chickens as if they understood her lectures. And beneath it all simmered an understanding neither dared name aloud. One evening after supper, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sky turned gold, then orange, deep purple. The wind carried the scent of wet grass, smoke, and the faint tang of horses. "Do you ever get lonely?" Lila asked, voice soft, almost vulnerable. "Sometimes," Harrison admitted. "But you stay. It's easier than being lonely in a crowd." Lila understood immediately. She had lived surrounded by people and still felt alone. This was different. Here, silence felt like relief. Here, company felt real. She spoke slowly, carefully. "Loneliness is worse when you're supposed to belong somewhere but don't." Harrison looked at her, his gray eyes searching, steady. "Is that how it was for you?" Lila nodded, throat tight. "I tried. I really tried. I prayed. I worked. I did everything. But it was never enough." "That wasn't your fault," he said quietly, with certainty that struck her to the core. "I see how hard you work, how much you care." How you sing while you cook, talk to chickens, mend things no one asked you to mend. If they couldn't see that, the fault was theirs, not yours. Lila blinked rapidly, tears welling. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not speak, but the warmth in his gaze said more than words could. For the first time in years, she felt entirely seen. As summer deepened, the prairie blossomed in wild profusion. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, and Lila found herself laughing, singing, and even dreaming. The warmth between her and Harrison no longer flickered uncertainly. It settled, steady, like the sun across the grasslands. Yet fear lingered. Deep in her chest, she carried the memory of being unwanted, cast aside, humiliated. Could she allow herself to hope again? Could she let someone in without fear of being broken once more? Harrison's steady presence, his protective strength, began to dissolve some of that fear, though she held it tightly still, cautious, wary. Late one night, long after the chores were done and the fire had burned low, Harrison came to the cabin quietly. He stood at the doorway, watching her sweep, the dim firelight reflecting off his eyes. "You should rest," he said softly. "I'm fine," she replied, brushing stubborn specks of dust from the floor. "No," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You need to rest. You've earned it. Let me help." Lila paused, heart hammering, and finally set the broom aside. She realized she was letting him in. Not just into her work, but into her life. Into her world. And for the first time in years, she felt safe, letting someone see her strength and her vulnerabilities together. By early August, Lila felt a strange, fluttering heaviness in her stomach. Not illness, not fatigue. Something else. Something that made her heart beat faster with cautious hope. Days passed, and she found herself laughing, crying, marveling at the simplest things. A sunset, a bird's song, the sway of wildflowers. Each movement reminded her of the tiny life growing inside her. Harrison noticed her changes immediately. He hovered with quiet attentiveness, bringing her tea, adjusting pillows, insisting she rest. "You're pregnant, not dying," she protested one afternoon, though she secretly cherished the care, the way he looked at her like she was carrying the most precious thing in the world. Finally, the day came when Lila rode into Red Willow and visited Willer Haynes, the town's healer. After careful examination, Willer's warm smile told her everything. "You're with child 4 or 5 weeks along, I'd say." Lila's knees weakened, and she pressed her hands to her stomach, tears streaming freely. "A miracle," she whispered, laughter breaking through sobs. "A miracle." Returning to the ranch, she found Harrison in the barn brushing copper. His eyes caught hers, wide and uncomprehending. "What is it?" he asked. "I'm pregnant," Lila said, voice trembling with joy and disbelief. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Harrison didn't move. Then the guarded expression melted away into unfiltered joy. He scooped her into his arms, spinning her around as laughter and tears mingled in the warm barn. "Are you sure?" he asked breathlessly. "Yes," she said, clutching him tightly. "A baby, ours." They spent the days that followed in a haze of preparation and wonder. Harrison built a cradle from pine, sanded and polished it until it gleamed. Lila rested more, tending the garden and the cabin while he watched over her with quiet devotion. Their evenings were filled with small, intimate moments, her hand on her belly, his hand over hers, the two of them speaking softly to the unborn child. Months passed. Lila's body grew with the life inside her, and Harrison's love grew with it, protective, steadfast, patient. In early December, labor came in the dark, hours before dawn. Harrison wrapped her in a shawl and helped her to the rocking chair while he rode for Willer Haynes. The labor was long and arduous. Lila's cries tore at Harrison's chest, but he stayed, pacing, praying, holding her hand, never leaving her side. Finally, a healthy, strong cry filled the cabin. A boy. Lila's tears fell freely as Willer placed the newborn in her arms. "Hello, little miracle," she whispered. Harrison knelt beside them, voice breaking. "He's beautiful. He's ours." Quote, "They named him Alistair Hudson, strong and deliberate, a promise of hope and love. The months that followed were filled with joy, laughter, and the small chaos of new parenthood. Lila's confidence grew. Harrison's devotion deepened. When Alistair was 6 months old, he babbled constantly, learning to reach for the world with stubborn delight. A year later, Lila discovered she was expecting again, and the second child, Calvin, arrived healthy and robust, completing their growing family. The ranch flourished under their hands. Fences were repaired, pastures expanded, and a larger barn rose on the land. Lila transformed the cabin into a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the smells of cooking. Harrison expanded the cattle herd, hired ranch hands, and together they built a life of love, hard work, and shared joy. Then, one bright June morning, a letter arrived. It was from her former mother-in-law. Lila's hands trembled as she read it. They wanted to visit, to see the children they had once dismissed, to reconcile. Lila folded the letter carefully, a quiet, final determination in her chest. "They want to come see us," she said simply. Harrison's hand settled on her back. "What will you do?" "Let them come," Lila said softly. "They need to see what they lost." 2 weeks later, the wagon rolled up the dirt road. Her former in-laws approached the porch, tentative, their expressions lined with regret. Lila stood firm, Alistair on her hip, Calvin clutching her skirt. Harrison stood beside her, protective, unwavering. "This is our family," Lila said calmly, eyes steady. "The children you called cursed, the ones you dismissed, the life you refused to see, you'll witness it now." Her former in-laws reached for the children, but Lila held them close. "You had your chance," she said softly. "You chose cruelty over kindness. You chose judgment over love. Now you live with that choice." She turned, holding her sons close, Harrison at her side, a solid wall of love and protection. They watched silently as her former in-laws retreated, their chance at redemption gone with the wind across the prairie. Later that night, with the boys asleep, Lila sat in the rocking chair Harrison had built, holding Calvin, Harrison at her side with his hand on her knee. "Do you think they'll try again?" he asked quietly. "Maybe," Lila said, stroking the baby's hair. "But it doesn't matter. This is our family, our life. They have no power here." Harrison nodded, thumb tracing gentle circles on her knee. "I love you, Lila." "I love you too," she whispered. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, bathed in moonlight. Inside, Lila Montgomery, once cast out, humiliated, and told she was broken, had found love, family, and a home she built with her own hands, her determination, and her heart. She pressed her hand to the window pane and whispered the words she had once spoken to an empty belly. "My children, they will regret losing you every day for the rest of their lives." The wind carried her vow across the land, across the endless prairie, across the forgiving frontier. And somewhere, quietly, the prairie seemed to whisper back, "You were never empty. You were always whole." Lila turned from the window, walked back to the home she had built, to the family she had fought for, to the life she had claimed. Harrison's arm wrapped around her, holding her close, steady, permanent. She had won. Not because she proved others wrong, but because she built a life filled with love. And that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all.